Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on unlocking economic growth, financing infrastructure development. I'm Stephen Bader, Executive Director of the East Bay Economic Development Alliance, or East Bay EDA. We're putting on this webinar with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission because of work that we've been doing around their Priority Production Area initiative, which seeks to maximize the utilization and value of our scarce industrial lands. East Bay EDA has already done a considerable amount of work in this area through our Resilient East Bay initiative, a cross-sector effort supported by academic, civic, and industry leaders who bring expertise, network, and resources to this work. We're excited that we have a fantastic panel lined up of experts and practitioners to provide you with some tips, tricks, and tools about how we tackle this important issue. To get us started, I'm going to turn things over to Ada Chan, Regional Planner at MTC, to say a few words and introduce our esteemed panelists. Ada, take it away.
Hello, my name is Ada, and I manage the local planning grants with MTC, one of them being the Priority Production Area. For those of you who don't know, MTC is the Regional Transportation and Planning, Financing, and Coordinating Agency for the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area. We work to support sustainable, equitable growth throughout our region. Through our planning grants and programs, MTC helps local jurisdictions plan for growth in a way that connects housing, jobs, and transportation across the Bay Area. In our Priority Production Area pilot program, we provide targeted funding and technical assistance to strengthen and retain industrial manufacturing areas that are vital to the region's economy. In our Priority Sites program, we focus on advancing key infill and redevelopment sites across the region, locations where new housing and job opportunities can take shape with the right infrastructure in place. What we've heard consistently from our city and county partners is the need for more infrastructure finance to make these plans a reality. We're so pleased to be working with East Bay EDA and with all of the leadership and thinking that they've provided. And we're in bringing this webinar to you all. So we're going to start off with Jason Moody, Managing Principal with EPS, who will provide a brief overview of commonly used municipal funding and financing tools. He'll be moderating a panel discussion with Avalon Schultz, Assistant Community Development Director with the City of San Leandro, Neal Harrison, Economic Development Manager with the City of Napa, and Aaron Laurel, City Manager of West Sacramento, who will share their experiences, strategies, and insights in utilizing these tools. Jason, take it away.
Thank you. There we go. I think I'm going to pull up a presentation here. Give me a second.
And while Jason does that, the presentation will be available for all the participants after this event, on the day after this event.
Okay. I want to make sure people can see my screen.
We can see it. And also just a reminder, folks, to put your questions in the Q&A or for the general group in the chat.
Thank you. So again, I'm Jason Moody. I'm a managing principal at Economic and Planning Systems. We're a real estate economics firm founded here in California. Actually, we've been working for 40 years in the Bay Area, but also we have offices in Sacramento and in Los Angeles. So we do a lot of public financing, and many of the tools that we're going to discuss, EPS does help cities develop, implement, and structure those tools. So I want to just start out by kind of framing this discussion a little bit, going back maybe 50 years to the kind of 3 significant milestones that have happened in California over the last 50 years that have really fundamentally shaped the landscape for public financing in the state. And in many ways have kind of tied our hands and forced us to use the tools that we're going to discuss. And you're probably all familiar with them, but probably the most significant is Prop 13, which limits property taxes to 1% of assessed value and requires that they only increase at 2% a year, which is usually less than inflation. So that kind of builds in a structural problem when your primary revenue source isn't increasing as fast as the inflation rate. It basically says that the only way to increase taxes for a specific purpose is a 2/3 vote. So you can go above 1%, but it's a 2/3 vote is required, which is a pretty high threshold. The second big event in 1996 was Prop 218, which further kind of turned the screws even tighter in terms of how you would limit, it started hitting other taxes, things like sales tax, hotels tax, business license tax, and assessments. And kind of what happened is that after Prop 13, cities started getting a little more creative with some of these other tools. And then Prop 218 came in and clamped down on those. And so made it even more difficult to use those. And so that was another thing. So now we're pretty much any tax that you want to increase, it's going to be a 2/3 vote. Unless it's a tax that's a general purpose tax, which means you aren't dedicating it to anything in particular, which is kind of counterintuitive. You think that would be a higher threshold, but actually politically it's harder to approve a tax where you're just taxing people and not telling them what you're going to use it for. So that's a 50% threshold. Whereas if you say we're going to use it for parks or for particular infrastructure, it's 2/3. Except for schools, they have a special exemption. The last thing that happened in 2012 was that we ended the redevelopment agencies, and which was another form of infrastructure financing, which was tax increment financing. Those were abolished. RDAs were abolished, and so that was another tool at the local level that cities now no longer have. So those three things have really handcuffed local jurisdictions in terms of how they can pay for infrastructure improvements. So now I want to go over what the most common tools that we currently have, and this is kind of a matrix. I'll go through some of these in more detail, but the general fund is still the most commonly used source for funding at the local level. Then followed by state regional grants and money from the state that comes in, and then the voter approved. You do have voter approvals, and then we have development impact fees, Melrose CFDs or other assessment districts, enhanced infrastructure financing districts, public-private partnerships, and development agreements. So the folks on the call today will, on the webinar today, will talk about their experience on some of these. And of course, we can talk about others as we go. But I'm going to quickly go over some of the key ones that we use now and some of their limitations, just to frame the discussion. So voter approved taxes that we already described, you need a 2/3 voter approval unless it's a general purpose. The advantages of this, of course, is if you do get it on the ballot, you can generate a fair amount of revenue this way if you get it approved, and it can be very flexibly used. And you can use the revenue to secure debt and advance very large projects. So if you can get an approval, it's a really good source of revenue. You can place it on the ballot either through a voter initiative or through city council vote. The disadvantages other than the 2/3 voter approval are, its political campaign can be costly and unpredictable. The actual revenue might be modest depending on the level of tax or how you tax it. For example, a parcel tax or a sales tax is kind of going to depend upon the level of sales in your community, et cetera. So there's some unpredictability associated with it. And of course, local taxes it does have economic consequences that need to be considered. The next one, development impact fees, very common, and most cities have development impact fees now. It's a one-time fee on new development, but it needs to comply with the Mitigation Fee Act, so there's some very specific rules around how they are applied. The advantages, it can be approved by the council, no voter approval is required. It's kind of a pay-as-you-go approach. It's not an ongoing tax burden on anybody. You can use it to there's some reimbursement mechanisms you can use so that you can oversize a facility and then gradually pay it back. The difficulty with this source is that it doesn't really provide funding up front. It's very difficult to use impact fees. You can't bond against impact fees. You can't use it up front to pay for major infrastructure improvements. So you need to have some sort of bridge measure to make it work, and then the reimbursements can take many years to materialize. You can't use it for operation and maintenance, and it's very unpredictable. You only get the money when development occurs, and it's hard to predict when that's going to happen. But it's still a very commonly used tool. The Melrose CFD, I'd probably say, is number 3 now that is used. It's a locally approved special district with the power to levy taxes on for public services, and you can also use it for tax exempt bonds. to secure tax-exempt bonds. So it is great in that you can bond against it. The structure of the bond, the taxes are approved by the residents or the property owners that establish it. It can provide a very secure source of revenue. It doesn't impact the city's general fund. So it's got some great benefits. The disadvantage, again, 2/3 voter approval, or if it's a property owner approval, it's by acreage, 2/3 of the property acreage. It does add an ongoing burden on the property. It can only use for publicly owned infrastructure, which is fine, but sometimes there's things that you want, private developers want to have that are privately owned, can't be used for that. And there's a fair amount of cost to establishing this, and typically it's usually only used when you have a greenfield situation where you don't need the 2/3 voter approval. But it's a great tool for those circumstances. It's usually not a good tool for citywide infrastructure because you never get the 2/3 voter approval for that. The Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District is kind of more of a newish. It's kind of the replacement of RDA with some advantages over old RDA redevelopment and some disadvantages. And we're going to have the panelists will talk about their experience with this one. Again, it can be approved by the city council. You don't necessarily need voter approval for this. It doesn't impose a tax. It's all tax increment, which is a great tool because it's just taking the existing taxes and using that, dedicating that to a particular purpose. You can use it to secure bonds. The geographic boundaries can be relatively flexible, non-contiguous. The disadvantages are it takes a while for that tax increment to build up. So maybe 7 to 10 years before you get enough tax increment before you can actually issue a bond. Probably the biggest disadvantage relative to the old RDA rule is that the only tax increment you get is the share for the jurisdictions that participate. So usually the city will form it and then they try and coax the county or other entities to participate so they can get part of their tax increment as well. That can be a very difficult process to get the county on board. And so you're kind of in that sense, just if it's just you, the city, you're just essentially committing your own general fund revenues to a particular purpose. It doesn't give you a lot of bang for the buck unless you get the county on board. And to get a fair amount of money from the IFD, you need to have a relatively large boundary for the tax increment. That's kind of needed to get enough revenue to do some significant investments. Public-private partnerships is increasingly common. Typically used to be used for like toll roads and things, but now it's actually being used for other things as well. Again, doesn't require city council approval, voter approval, just city council. It kind of reduces the city's financial obligations and risk because you're essentially allowing a private sector development to essentially finance, build, and operate a project, and it's kind of off the books from the city's perspective. And it does combine the expertise of a private sector with the kind of full faith and credit of the city or the public entity that's involved, and so it can facilitate a very efficient project execution and access to private capital. So there's a fair amount of advantages to this. The disadvantages, again, high transaction costs, procurement costs, project complexity to get these together. You need to have a very competent private sector partner to do it, and they need to be well financed and experienced. And there's always the question about kind of misaligned interest between and the public accountability when you have a private sector operator operating and running a really important public good, and they have their interest, which is to make sure it's a profitable endeavor for them, and sometimes that might run afoul of what the public is interested in. And it can expose the public sector to financial institutional risk. And if there's mismanagement, if there's some corruption or backroom dealing or whatever, there's been some scandals around public-private partnerships in the past, and it's certainly not endemic, but it is potential to have a problem like that can discredit the endeavor that you're trying to finance and the city that's involved in it as well, and the elected officials. Finally, the one I want to talk about is the developer agreements or contributions, or what we often refer to as community benefit contributions. This is increasingly common in very strong markets like the Bay Area, where a city has some leverage over a developer if they have a discretionary approval, an entitlement that they want from the city can then exact or require that as a condition of approval that the developer provide some major community contributions for infrastructure. This is often secured through a development agreement, but sometimes a lot of cities now have just kind of more formulaic community benefit requirements for any project that doesn't comply with existing zoning. They have to pay community benefits. It's becoming more and more common in the Bay Area. And again, no voter approval required. Again, these are being used because all of these don't have voter approval threshold. Doesn't impose a tax on residents. It supports the whole concept of a value capture. So you're essentially leveraging the public sector's land use authority and in some cases their assets, or maybe if it's next to a transit station or something, you can get the value capture using community benefits. The funds can be used in a very flexible way. The disadvantages are it does preempt the existing local planning regulations. It's pretty hard. It requires time and resource to execute these agreements, especially if there's multiple owners or developers involved. It can be really complex to do a DA in that circumstance. So it's usually better as a one-to-one type relationship. And it tends to be focused on very one-time discrete community benefits that address a particular need that is often associated with the project itself. Maybe a park that's right next to a project, or some sort of community amenity that, and then once that's over, it's not an ongoing revenue source. So that's the kind of the primary tools in the toolkit that we use now in California due to the inability to raise taxes in the way that many other states allow, which is using property taxes or even tax increment financing. So now I'm going to pass it on. I'm going to stop sharing and pass it on to who's next on the list? I think it's
Aaron.
Aaron. Okay. Take myself off video.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aaron Laurel. I'm the city manager and port CEO for the city of West Sacramento. Pleasure to be joining you today. I'm actually from the Bay Area, so I probably have a good sense of most of the communities that are represented here. I wanted to just take a moment just to kind of touch on the 5 or 6 different tools for financing infrastructure that Jason covered. I think that was a really good overview of kind of the lay of the land today in California. We in West Sacramento, if you don't know about our community, I'm going to show an aerial kind of where we are relative to the region. But in general, we're a smaller community, about 60,000 people, 23 square miles. So we have a lot of growth still to go. But most of our focus is on infill development, primarily around our urban riverfront that we share with downtown Sacramento. If you're familiar with a couple of the landmarks that if you drive through West Sac, you've been here before, we have IKEA. Everyone loves having an IKEA, but we also have more prominently the ballpark, Sutter Health Park, where right now, and I'm sorry for all the Bay Area people that are or were former A's fans, but we do have the A's playing here in our town for the next couple of years, but also we have the Giants AAA affiliate, so strong Bay Area ties there. And a lot of the work that we're doing around infrastructure along the riverfront is focused in the area around that ballpark. So in terms of the tools that Jason covered, we are pretty strong practitioners in all of those, some more than others. We do have, in terms of voter approved measures, and we're talking about transactions and use taxes, which is a similar tool to sales tax with some slight differences. We have actually 5 on the books, totaling 2%. So we're at the limit in California for how far you can go before you get additional approval from the state legislature. Many of those tax measures are used to fund different types of infrastructure and maintenance of infrastructure. So whether it was for park improvements or other community-wide improvements, most of the measures that we have, or roads, most of the measures that we have are at least in part funding infrastructure. Impact fees, I always tell people, it's difficult to do because you have your nexus studies, you have the things that impact fees pay for, and it's usually a long list. But often the case is that cities don't do a great job of prioritizing the investments of impact fees to leverage other funds and to do it in a way that can help catalyze additional investment in your communities. That's just a point I always make to people. We have about 30 CFDs in our city, everything from use in sort of like newer areas like Jason described but also in infill situations. We do have some where we have smaller infill projects or large infill areas that are being repurposed, and we worked with our developers to set up CFDs in order to leverage our tax increment financing that I'll get to in a second. Um, DAs is also similar. We have DAs that we use on large scale residential projects, but also sometimes in infill settings. A good recent example is a project where we had an infill housing developer and the city wanted a park in this neighborhood that really lacked park space. And so we worked with that developer to have the builder construct the park, and then the city reimbursed using both fees and tax increment from the project. So I'm going to share just to put just a map up here to kind of orient you to West Sacramento. So if you can see my cursor, everything west of the river, this is Sacramento River here. This is the primary infill area of West Sacramento. We also have a more suburban area to the south. And most of the tools that we use are focused in on this riverfront area. It has capacity for about 15 million total square feet of mixed-use development. Like I said, we have the stadium that's been there. We're actually looking at it as a potential for MLB expansion into Sacramento, being in West Sacramento. But also what you notice if you're familiar with Sacramento or you're looking at this photo or this aerial is the lack of crossings between the two cities on the river. So a lot of the infrastructure that we're doing is related to bridges, both pedestrian bridges, but also multimodal bridges. Those are, as you all know, very expensive. And so they require a lot of different types of financing sources to get there. Our main one, I'm going to stop sharing, can bring it back up if you want later, is EIFD. So I know the group wanted me to mainly focus on that. We were the first EIFD in California. It's really not a big secret. We actually receive a higher percentage of property tax than most cities do. On average in California, that number is typically between 10 to 15% of the property tax dollar that is actually goes to the city. In our case, the number is much higher. And for that reason, coming off the heels of redevelopment dissolution, we had to act quickly and meaningfully. And we did a lot of work with the legislature to enact bills that ultimately paved the way for EIFDs to kind of take the place of redevelopment tax increment. So we were the first one. We did form it on our own. It doesn't have county participation or other taxing entity participation. It's been on the books for about 10 years, and most notably, just this year, we issued the first bonds, true EIFD bonds in California. So now we have about $60 million in bond proceeds in this first tranche. We plan on issuing hundreds of millions of dollars more in tax increment bonds to fund all of our infrastructure that we need for the riverfront to really take shape. But most of that work is going into repurposing former industrial areas to be suitable for urban mixed-use scale development. And that includes things like your basic underground utilities, road reconfigurations and new roads. Like I said, those connections to other parts of the city and across the river to downtown Sacramento, including transit. We're also working on a light rail extension project. And you name it, we're kind of doing it on our side of the river. And the main fuel for that has really been EIFDs and then leveraging many other sources. One that wasn't mentioned because it's uncertain and you have to work for it is grant funding. So we have been very heavily involved in getting state grant funds, federal funds when California could do that. Hopefully we'll see that day again. But right now we're really focused on some of the state programs that focus on infill development, including the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program and the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program. We've been heavy users of those programs. So really, our story is mostly about tax increment and EIFD. I'm happy to answer questions or respond to the chat on kind of some of the best practices. But in general, what I'll say is that what I always advise cities that are looking at doing this for the first time is to plan big. One of the key differences with EIFDs versus redevelopment is you can set these districts up today and effectively not really turn them on until later. And it's all about capturing the growth in property tax. And so the sooner you can get them set up and on the books, the more potential revenue that can be directed to them. Because at the end of the day, it's really about issuing bonds. It's about issuing debt. And so the more cash flow you have to pay the debt service, you're going to build that up over time. As Jason said, it can sometimes take up to 10 years to generate enough to issue bonds. And so I always say think big, think early when you're looking at these districts. The other thing in terms of the flexibility, Jason mentioned that counties can participate. So you can do a city-county EID. There are some in the state. Counties are often reluctant to do it because they think back to redevelopment and they say, well, why would I give you all of our property tax growth for something that, we're not really sure you need? And so instead with EIDs, it can be poised as an investment tool because the county doesn't have to give 100% of its increment. It could do 50%, it could do 20%. But every dollar that goes is to going to something that will be invested by the city into development that, but for the investment in infrastructure, won't happen. And in that way, the county can see it hopefully as an investment in that they're paying for some of it, but they're getting the upside of the remaining property tax that they didn't pledge. So I'll stop there. I think Avalon from San Leandro is next. And so I'll kick it over to her and I'll be around for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Neal. We are definitely earlier in our journey exploring these different district tools, so I definitely was taking a lot of notes as you were speaking. Hi, everyone. I'm Avalon Schultz. I work for the city of San Leandro. We're located next to Oakland in the East Bay, and we have a very diverse land use space. We've got a lot of industrial land, which is really vital to the city's economy, and we're also an aging city, so we were formed in 1872, so we've got really major capital needs, and we've been speaking with the council for years about our capital needs and our deficits in different ways to address the capital needs. For reference, like our roads alone, we basically have as many lane miles as if you drove from San Leandro all the way down to Los Angeles. And I think our public works director did a great job of quantifying some of these infrastructure needs and putting them into terms that the council could more readily wrap their minds around. We have our own library system, so we've got those capital needs. We actually did receive a grant to build a brand new library recently. We have our own wastewater treatment plant and facility, so that comes with its own needs, and over 80 acres of parks here in the city. So as we've been looking to, new development and looking for unique ways to fund our infrastructure needs, this has been a really relevant topic. And we're actually currently working with NBS and Cosmont on a district-based financing study and evaluation for the city. And we're hoping that will culminate in recommendations to have a non-contiguous EIFD formed. So that's something that is really compelling. And we have a few sites in town that we can talk about today that are a priority for us. I'm just looking to see if I can share screen here. Here we go. And this will be coming up shortly. And then you can get a little bit better sense of where we're located and what we're looking at. So the map on the left is some of our key opportunity sites in San Leandro, some areas that might be eligible for district financing as we proceed. I wanted to highlight this kind of teal area is our industrial base. So that location is something we're mostly looking at issues surrounding power shortage. I know that's an issue East Bay EDA is looking into as well, making sure that we have capacity and we can support industry here in the East Bay. I also wanted to point out, I'll be talking a little bit more about our shoreline public-private partnership project over here. We are located on the bay, so sea level rise is another infrastructure need that we're looking at along with a lot of other cities in the Bay Area. And then we are also, we're blessed to have 2 BART stations in San Leandro, so we're also looking at forming transit-oriented developments around those BART stations. We have our traditional downtown where a lot of work has been done, and then our emerging TOD is at Bayfair Mall, which was a regional shopping center that's been converting over time into more of a jobs, research and development campus. There will still be retail going forward, but also we're looking at bringing in housing and other mixed uses. And one of the key issues that we're facing with the Bayfair site is how to get better access to the BART station. So we'll be working on looking at an EIFD possibility for this site, and primarily, like Aaron was talking about, having bridges that are possibly multimodal to connect transit to the new mixed use opportunity area is really critical. And then the BART property is actually split between 2 jurisdictions. It's City of San Leandro and unincorporated Alameda County. And so we think this might be an interesting use case to work with the county, who's also looking to see the BART site developed in the future. They have the site in their housing element, and we'd like to coordinate with the county and look at ways that an EIFD could help leverage, growth and increment property taxes over time to help fund some of the infrastructure needs, including accessibility to the BART station from the county side, and then these crossings and ways to bring people in and out of the area as it develops over time. I also will highlight, let's see, it's not advancing. Give me one sec. What am I doing wrong? There we go. So this is just another project that I wanted to highlight up front. This is our Shoreline Public-Private Partnership project, and the city has a planned 9-acre park on the bay. This was a former marina. It lost funds for dredging for boats, and so the city's been working for the last few decades on how to re-envision this area and bring more economic value and more community benefits. So a 9-acre park is planned along with 500 units of housing and a hotel. And so a CFD was formed for this entire area that would be able to provide bonding for future improvements, including the public park. And something unique about this CFD is when we structured it, the thought was that the initial bond period would be for that upfront infrastructure. And then in 30 years' time, once those bonds are repaid, it would likely be time to address more sea level rise in this vicinity. And there could be a second issuance of bonds where the CFD, the assessment would stay relatively stable, but there would be another major capital tranche of issuance of bonds so that we could then do some adaptation work. And so I think that was an interesting idea. And we know that our neighbors in Alameda are doing the same thing. So those are just some of the ways that the city, I'll stop sharing now, but those are some of the ways that the city of San Leandro is looking at district-based financing for our infrastructure needs. We also use development agreements. We use kind of a mix and match tool bag of these different strategies that were shared by Jason. I will just say regarding impact fees is we actually recently restructured our park impact fees in order to be sensitive to market feasibility. So I think as we look at what we can impose on developers, I would just put in a pitch to say it's really important to know what is feasible in your market and not to just look at what other people are doing, because especially in the Bay Area, the prices of housing, the cost of rents, they can vary greatly from city to city. And so really attuning to your local market and having a market feasibility assessment done and be able to explain to your city council why maximizing impact fees may not be the move if it results in no development is a key thing in order to make sure that your fees are right sized. And then if your market matures and you have more wiggle room in the future, you can always go back and raise those fees. But in our case in San Leandro, we've been really sensitive to attuning to the market needs and trying to position ourselves well so that we remain attractive for development. And in some cases, that means looking for other creative ways to finance infrastructure, not just expecting that the development market will take care of it entirely. So I will wrap it up there. I know there'll be more time for Q&A and pass it over to Neal.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, a little delay there. Great presentations. So I am Neal Harrison, the Economic Development Manager for the City of Napa. So we're in the North Bay. I have 2 slides to share regarding our EIFD. But first, just to comment on a few things that around infrastructure financing that Jason touched on and our other panelists touched on. One measure we passed 25-30 years ago was a sales tax measure for a flood control project for the city of Napa. So this was a massive flood control initiative. It's ongoing right now. It really, the phase 1 of that work was to shore up flood control in our downtown core, the city of Napa. And that has led to massive redevelopment in our downtown. If anyone's visited Napa in the past, like 10 or so years, you've probably seen those changes. And there's additional phases on the north and south of our downtown to opening up for redevelopment. So that's a great example of sales tax measure approved by voters. That was the local match for federal funding to get that going. And then secondly, in terms of development agreements, we use those quite a bit. And just recently, we approved a development agreement for a new hotel, branded residential project in our core downtown, and we're using TOT revenue share for public improvements there. So that's another pretty cool example of a development agreement use. And we're also considering some other development agreements related to TOT share. But I really wanted to talk about our EIFD. So let me share my slides here. Okay. I think everyone can see that. So our EIFD was formed in July 2022, and I thank Aaron and West Sacramento for paving the way for this EIFD. It took about 18 months for us to form. We started off with a feasibility study that looked at kind of growth potential, redevelopment potential in core areas around the city. We decided that the potential was there to form an EIFD, to justify forming an EIFD. We did go to the county early on in the process to discuss them joining the EIFD and potential projects that we could co-fund together. The county declined. The door's still open, so we're continuing to share with them progress in our EIFD. It is non-contiguous. You can see from the map on the right, we basically captured our greater downtown area that is continuing to see redevelopment and investment in a large part because of the flood control project I spoke about. We also captured areas, kind of key redevelopment sites, industrial sites, sites that were in our general plan as corridor improvement areas. So we grabbed those two in our EIFD. And lastly, down in the south side of the city, we annexed a bunch of land from the county that is now, it's currently being developed. There's a Costco that opened up down there. And it's planned to have 900 units of housing. Some of those housing units are online, and there's other industrial and retail uses. So we have 50% of our tax increments going into the EIFD. And Aaron talked about this in the West Sacramento case. It starts off small, but it's growing, and we're starting to see consistent revenue in our EIFD, which is exciting. In terms of our infrastructure financing plan, we kept that really broad. We listed some key projects that we would be interested in using the EIFD to help fund, but because we didn't go with the county and just because of future needs that we were thinking of at the time, we just said, hey, let's just keep it broad, get the money going. And so we're at the point now where we're shortlisting our priority projects and talking with internally about that. And again, the goal of our EIFD is to leverage the funding in the EIFD as a checking account, so we can use that money for planning and design work, just kind of spending that money, or bond financing and leveraging it with other financing to create that capital stack for larger infrastructure projects. I wanted to talk about advantages. I know there's a lot of conversation about, whether these are worth it if you don't join with the county or not. So we did not, we're not in part of our EIFD does not have the county. However, this is money that is set aside, again, 50% of that increment goes into our EIFD fund versus the general fund, and our team in economic development manages that. So that's an advantage of having a set fund that we can control. Of course, there's approval processes and so forth, but that is an advantage, like redevelopment once was. We also use our EIFD as a strategic framework. So we have a whole list of projects, and you can see that map on the left, associated with things that we want to do in economic development to unlock growth. And so we frame it as like these are within our EIFD sub areas, that if we're successful, we're not only seeing some redevelopment, but we're maximizing growth within the EIFD that we can then take that money, reinvest it for that virtuous cycle. As I mentioned before, we have flexible, our IFP is flexible on what we can use. And the EIFD law is also wide ranging. So there's a lot of things you can use this money for. And we also, anytime we write a grant now, we mention that we have an EIFD, and that many of the projects we're writing grants for are advancing growth in those sub areas within our EIFD. And then also using the EIFD for matching funding for grants in the future. And then I'll also just say, because we're not with the county or another agency, it lessens the complications in management to some extent. So that also is good. So I see the EIFD particularly as not a siloed program, but a way to align our planning efforts, our capital stacks, different funding tools that Jason had mentioned earlier in the presentation, to unlock that economic growth and advance our economic development work. So I'll end it there and pass it back over to Jason for a Q&A.
Sure, thank you. This is great. All these are great examples. I'm interested. I have questions for everybody, but Neal, let's start with you since you were the last one talking. I'm curious how you were able to get the EIFD approved by the city council without the county's participation, because essentially you're taking general fund revenue that they would otherwise have discretion over, and now you're saying we're gonna kind of lock that in for particular uses. And some city councils are kind of wondering what's the benefit if there's all the, there's public safety needs and all these other things, and how do you convince them?
Yeah, so I think it starts with we were able to convince the leadership within the city. So getting early on the approval and buy-in from our city manager, our city attorney, community development director, and other directors, that this was a good use. And as I said earlier, we started off with just a simple feasibility study that could show how much money could be generated given short and medium term pipeline projects that we were seeing. So like that, right there was important. And then educating council members on how this fund could be leveraged, especially for bond financing, which isn't something that the city is accustomed to. Frankly, we have some special districts and so forth, enterprise funds that have done it. But saying that, we could go out and bond and leverage for infrastructure needs, convinced the city council and convinced, others in parks and public works that we can work together on the various projects. And it was unanimous approval for the EIFD. So people, education early, they bought in.
Yeah, that's great. I guess another question I think is something that Avalon brought up, but I'm particularly interested in the case of West Sacramento in this area, because you've layered in Aaron, you've layered in so many different tools. You got CFDs, you have EIFDs, which you have impact fees, et cetera. Has the development community come back and said, you've got too many burdens on us and you're making it difficult for us to develop? You know, the CFD tax, we have impact fees we have to pay. Obviously, the EIFD is not a direct cost to them, but there are other things that you mentioned. I'm wondering if you've had to navigate that at all.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's timely too. I want to start just by kind of going back to what Neal was saying in his response. One thing I'll add to the discussion you may all be having with your, your leadership, city management, city councils. And Jason, you brought this up at the very beginning. The number one source still for infrastructure projects in California is typically general fund dollars. And that's a challenge. So you're already having those competing interests when you're also trying to figure out how to fund public safety if you're a full service city. And so one way to frame it is EIFDs. We worked really hard to amend the legislation in positive ways to the point now where it's really the only source of revenue that you receive that you can bond against without a public vote or without having to pledge an asset. So those of you that are more finance geeks like me, you know that you can do lease revenue bonds, you can take money and pledge your city hall as debt. Well, the EIFD is really the only form that you don't have to do that. And so the other point I made earlier is that you can set it up today and the money, it can be used as a pay-as-you-go source, but it can also sit there and you're really not competing with the general fund until you're ready to issue debt. And in that way, you can kind of swap what otherwise would have been general fund dollars with now money going to the EIFD bonds to be able to do a bunch more projects quicker than you would have as a pay-as-you-go. So back to your point about the developers who are looking at the overall scope of what they're paying, whether it's CFD dollars or development impact fees, we have made adjustments, and it kind of relates to what Avalon was saying, slightly differently, but same concept. Our impact fees were traditionally very high, and we asked a lot of questions of ourselves that why is that? And I think what we found was a lot of it is done kind of on a formulaic basis, city to city. We throw everything into the hopper and it gives us what the number needs to be to address all the infrastructure projects that we need to build. There's a bit of consideration given to grant funds and other funding sources that go into what otherwise impact fees would be contributing to. But what we didn't do early on was really factor in the EIFD. And we kind of raised the question, challenged ourselves to say, how can our impact fees be as among the highest in the region when we have the biggest tool in the region to pay for infrastructure? And so we got a little more strategic and kind of surgical with our fees. And we just recently lowered our impact fees significantly in our infill areas, which overlays the same area as the EIFD, with the logic being that most of the EIFD investments are going to go to benefit these areas and help finance some of the projects that are already in the fee study list. So that's kind of been our response. The last thing I'll say is on CFDs, they're great to pair with EIFDs. If you have a developer that wants something from you in terms of infrastructure to help a project go along and they're pitching you on an EIFD, well, that's going to take a while. So one approach, and I know EPS has worked on this type of arrangement, you set up a CFD and then you also simultaneously set up the EIFD. And as the CFD debt is issued, the EIFD revenue from that same project can help pay for the debt service on the CFD bonds. And then eventually you can do EIFD bonds. So that's just another little trick we've learned along the way. So
Yeah, it's not like you guys are using all the tools all at once, which is you're kind of on the forefront here. I have one more question for you before I have a question for Avalon, but which is, can you describe a little bit about some of the infrastructure improvements or what are you using that money for and how? Because obviously that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, where like we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and everybody likes those things, you hope. So that's how do you choose and prioritize infrastructure investments when you're using these tools?
I'll be as brief as possible here, and really it goes back to our kind of story around redevelopment. When the city incorporated, we've only been a city since 1987, and we had a very large redevelopment agency relative to the size of our city. And so we really focused the tax increment dollars from redevelopment on infrastructure serving the riverfront in order to unlock a lot of the areas that were former industrial. And that's still happening today by and large, and whether it's repurposing these areas through things like infrastructure improvements, brownfield cleanups, you name it, anything to support infill. but also a lot of these areas were not very well connected to other parts of the city or to the larger markets in downtown Sacramento. So the bonds we just issued, $60 million, the bulk of the funding from those bonds is going to our contribution to a replacement bridge for the I Street Bridge, which is a bridge that links us to the Sacramento rail yards. So that's probably the best example of a very large scale project that's benefiting from the EIFD.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, that's great. Avalon, I have a question. Since you're right kind of in the middle of this, trying to get these various tools, getting started on these tools, can you talk a little bit about the political environment that you're facing and whether or not you're getting any pushback, or how are you doing outreach and that process?
It's a good question, and we're still early stages. So we're more in the kind of due diligence phase of figuring out what the different needs are for different areas, looking at the geographic composition that we might be willing to recommend to council. And then I think, to what the other speakers have mentioned is like really being able to explain the value to city leadership first, I think is critical. So we've had our finance team, in all the meetings with us, with the consultants, talking about just from the ground up what these forms of financing are, kind of how they work, how they can benefit, the general fund, and just trying to kind of socialize the idea before we come in with an actual proposal. And then I think the other question that's really interesting is just looking at the development community, looking at the trade-offs, as Aaron was mentioning, with other financing, forms like impact fees, and just trying to understand the whole picture. I think one thing that we've been really advocating in San Leandro is trying not to look at each of these topics, in a vacuum, because they layer, and it's to the developer, it's all one thing. And so I think trying to understand how, the cost of doing business, how our processes overlap with our fees, also looking at, what the benefits of development are for the city, and how we can then look at those trade-offs when we evaluate what we're extracting or what we're asking for. It's all part of this scenario. So I think we want to really understand, more holistically, and our council's been asking for that as well, not just looking at one fee, but really looking at the whole universe and how they interplay. So it's required us to bring in, I think, a lot of special expertise, because we tend to be more generalists, and so we've needed to lean on some consultants with expertise in these different areas to help it be a more informed discussion.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a really good lead in, because Neal has mentioned that he did a feasibility study first to kick it all off. And Neal, do you want to just describe a little bit of what goes into that feasibility study? What are some of the parts that if that was a key to unlocking this amongst the policymakers, be interested to know what type of findings or analysis you did.
Yeah, it was a pretty simple a study. We worked with Cosmont companies to essentially look at our universe of pipeline projects, entitled projects, pipeline projects, and projects in areas we were seeing interest from as redevelopment. As I mentioned earlier, our downtown is seeing quite a lot of redevelopment investment over the years, and there's more parcels that had entitlements on them or were in in the process of getting entitled. And then there was an annexed area from the county that was the 900 plus units of housing and a Costco, et cetera. So just with that, not even taking in consideration some of the longer term, like kind of general plan corridor projects, that right there, and looking at kind of the percentage of tax increment that could go into the EIFD, ours is 50%, but we looked at kind of the range. What if it was 100? What if it was 25%? And could justify that there was enough revenue potential to be generated to bond finance within 5-10 years of the EIFD. So that was the purpose of showing that analysis, that again we can go educate our city council and our city leadership, and then also have that conversation with the county.
Yeah, that's very helpful. We have 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure there's somebody else who's itching to say something, either the public or our moderators. I don't want to be dominating all the questions here.
Hey, Jason, if I could just make a quick plug, I put it in the chat as well, but when we talk about EIFDs or CREAs and some of the other tools that people are interested in, this is a hard copy of the primer that CalEd, the California Association for Local Economic Development, which Stephen and I are both on the board for. They put together now a second edition of this publication. It has really good information at a high level, but also kind of more specifics on how these districts work, how to go about forming them. So I'd really encourage people to download it. It's free. It's on the CalEd website, and I put a couple links in the Q&A.
Thank you. Okay, well, we only have a few minutes left. Are there some closing remarks that maybe Stephen wants to make, or somebody else? Or any questions from the public? I don't know if we're opening it to the public, but we had one question about how many EIFDs have there been formed. And Aaron says at least 20. That's good to know. And yeah, we get it. EPS gets questions all the time about helping form EIFDs, and so everybody is, and the rules around forming them have become easier. So in many ways, it's kind of like, let's do it and then decide if we need to. A lot of communities are just doing it first and then deciding when they would activate it, because you can kind of form it before you actually issue bonds or you start taking the revenue and allocating it. It's kind of a relatively painless just to create one and then see what happens.
Also, I'm not sure, can everyone see the Q&A, or is it going only directly to the panelists in terms of Tim's last question? Asking about EIFDs are basically the only financing form left where you can issue debt without a vote and without an asset pledge to back it up. Is this correct?
That is basically correct. Today you can issue without a vote, yes, or the example he gave of using, it's kind of a leaseback term, which is another thing that has happened, where you would say, I want to build a new city hall. We'll get a private developer to build it, and they will secure debt using your lease agreement. So your lease revenue will essentially secure the debt. It's another backhand way to kind of pay for infrastructure, but it's essentially secured against the general fund revenue. So it does take general fund revenue. It's not any new money that's being created, although you do access private capital, which is nice.
Yeah, and just to give one more bit of detail on that, the bonds that we just issued for the EIFD are unique in that the only source security for the bonds is the revenue itself. So unlike other forms of bonds like lease revenue bonds, it's really the city's credit rating that's on the hook for it. So it's those of you that remember redevelopment agencies, it's very similar to that. But I guess one difference is you're really only using the amount of increment you have available to you right now. You're not looking ahead and pledging the promise of future revenue, which got some cities into trouble back then. So, but that is a key difference between lease revenue bonds and EIFD bonds. It's only the revenue from the EIFD that's securing the debt.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and it looks like everyone can see the Q&A just to answer that question. So, thank you.
And some people are typing in answers, which I appreciate. Thank you.
Well, we are going to have to wrap up. So I want to say thank you to Jason, Aaron, Neal, Avalon for their great both sort of overview of these topics and really practical working examples of how all these issues come together. I want to thank Ada Chan and MTC for their partnership on this work, which we are going to continue to do. Please, if you're not already connected to our work through our Resilient East Bay initiative in particular, definitely take a look at our website and do sign up for our monthly newsletter that comes out. It's also posted on our blog. The link to that is in the chat. And stay tuned for other events that we have coming up through the balance of this year and into 2026. We look forward to seeing all of you again soon. Take care.